Feigned apology for sloth. Victorious sounding excuse. Self-deprecating metaphor. Chilling and suspenseful motivational introduction, contrasting the value of time spent doing this against something that actually is valuable. It's the halfway mark to the finished result. We're still doing the same exact thing as we were doing before, but we're doing it with 320 grit this time. That's getting deep into the medium grits. We're still using these things too, what's left of them. I keep breaking them and cutting them up. This is what the 220 grit finish would look like if we all just left it alone. It doesn't look too bad, does it? Up close, it's easy to see the grain I left. I really did a great job here. I mentioned how when you hit 220, it starts to actually feel softer and smooth. Now I'm going to absolutely destroy what I did here by making it smoother in a completely different direction. Oh, good gravy, every single time that you change direction on this grain, on any cast part this large or this complex, you go through flashbacks of exactly how long the previous 4 steps took to get here, to step 4. That's right, there's a step 0, and it too is a step. Anyway, you know you're at the very beginning of dozens of hours of work again. But there's some good news in all this, right? Yes, there's a good bit of it. All that work that we did planing in the coarse to medium grits before this pays dividends right now. Of course, there's the obligatory crevice that slows you down along the way, just like every good road course has at least one hairpin. But all those flat areas being flat and the edges being defined lets you use a lighter touch now. You don't have to be in such a high pressure hurry anymore to cut through all the contamination. You're in the soft, pure aluminum layer with a medium grit. And all you have to do is pretty much trace over your previous work at 90 degrees. Simple repetition will get you through the defects that you need to remove. And at this point, you'll even be able to feel the surface imperfections through the sandpaper as they disappear because of how the traction changes. So not just the texture, not just the color, you also now can use traction as a thing to help you guide your way. One of the main reasons paying attention to your traction is helpful is because at this point right now we're using a dry process. And in a dry process, you're required to brush or blow the debris away. And particles from the sandpaper will degrade, break down, and sometimes even break away from the media. If you feel the sensation of something buzzing underneath or rolling under the sandpaper, you could actually do damage to the spot where you're working, so you need to clean whatever funk that you can out of there before that happens. We're at a stage where the grit's getting so fine that it becomes a more and more frequent occurrence. That comes with yet another problem. The more you clear that dust away by blowing on it, the more and more of it becomes airborne. Aluminum dust can stay suspended in the air for quite some time, and the amount of aluminum dust that it takes to exceed human exposure limits on a dangerous level is 5 times greater than the amount you'll ever be able to create in a week of doing this. But if you're a foot away from the thing blowing on it, breathing the air around it, it's a surefire way to concentrate the effect. Especially if you have lung or kidney problems, mask up. Wear a dust mask. Maybe use a vacuum cleaner instead of blowing on anything. We've got lots of opportunities to make aluminum airborne when we're polishing an aluminum part, but if you've been stubborn up until now, the particles are small enough that they're going to irritate you. It's literally the only hazard anywhere in this job aside from the damage caused to your social life. Before my boilerplate intro when this video started, we were at 119 hours of just sanding metal to get here. By now you understand that all you have to do is take an extremely hard material and use the least abrasive tools possible to cut and barely remove anything off of it for like 200 hours. That about sums it all up, the TLDR version. That's a whole lot of time to spend on a 0 horsepower gain, yet here I am, again. This time, the technique is just to make a shiny spot and keep making it bigger. There's no rule or path to follow or anything. The texture's here to guide you, and the new texture you're laying down is there to show you. I don't really care much about what part is the easy part or what's last anymore. It all pretty much sucks exactly the same way from a time standpoint. So now I just go ahead and do it all. But my calluses are great now. If you take a break from guitar to do this, have no concerns. You'll be able to pick right back up from where you left off, no pain. Slightly crippled, of course, but the calluses, man, they're great. I quit wearing gloves, because they're costing me a fortune lately. A bar of soap's like $1. Anyway, You can see how much finer the 320 grit scratches appear. It looks like there's 4 times as many of them and they're a quarter as deep. It's nice. The bird's eye perspective over the workbench shows off the most flaws on the part because the lights are directly behind the camera angle and its reflection. The vertical scratches that I'm trying to remove show up very well in some areas where this happens, but they're getting really hard to see wherever there isn't a highlight. I wish y'all could have the same exact perspective that I get here, kind of like a moving camera around the spot where I'm working, so you can put the light right where you need it. That's probably the only thing perspective-wise my videos lack, but if you're the one doing this, you'll have that to your advantage. It's always going to be obvious to you what needs more work or when to move on. The large exhaust flange area here is mostly obstructed, but I'm slacking at nothing. I set the bar really high the first time, and I can already tell that this one's going to turn out even better. It's a hard to see area, but it's still the easiest one for onlookers and judges to get to and spot, you know? So I just go ahead and polish all the difficult, obstructed, and hard to reach stuff and treat it the exact same way. I introduced this series explaining what the goal of this process is, and I'm not going to demonstrate anything less than what I promised. You can polish a part without doing any of this kind of work that you're watching. The people that, kind of take the shortcut lazy route, they move that work to another spot. And if they skip it, it's going to affect its quality. It also takes a lot more work to maintain when you do that. There are tricks to skipping all of the sanding on some parts, and I'll show you that later. The kinds of parts and how you get away with it sort of thing. But on centerpiece parts, if you want those trophies or your build requires perfection, then you can't skip any of the suffering. And here's why all that suffering's a good thing. If you look at the clock and you've been paying attention to the previous videos, you'll see those dividends that I was talking about earlier and promising you all the way along paying off big time right now. We've never completed a whole side in less than 9 hours anywhere in this whole series, not on any side yet. We're moving at a pace that's nearly twice as fast as before, and that's even with the lighter touch. Planing anything out with these finer grits would take eons if we had to do it here. But because it's done already, there's no extra work to be done besides just getting through and replacing that texture. It's where this part goes from just starting to feel soft to having a really nice milky smooth glow about it. It's almost cartoon-like. The lines and shapes suddenly look cleaner, straighter, and more defined. The edges of all the intersections are smoothly radiused and consistent now, and the reflections are beautiful. Nothing is lopsided. In fact, we made the casting look dozens of times better than it ever could have been when it was brand new, because nearly all the flat surfaces and edges of a factory casting are all over the place. We cleaned all of that up. Because this is the internet, though, some people are going to insist that this treatment removes stress risers in the casting and strengthens the material. I want you to know that absolutely nothing about that matters at all. This will offer absolutely no additional durability whatsoever to a cylinder head. This part always blows up from the inside out, so it's going to destroy a polished cylinder head the exact same way that an unpolished one's going to go, and at exactly the same speed. It'll have no concern or regard for how much time you spent making the outside of it look like this either. Some internet comments might also insist that this is going to change the operating temperature of my engine because, now I've cut down on its surface area and made everything shiny. Those individuals are disregarding how radiators and thermostats work and the differential in surface area between an engine part and your radiator fins. There's no benefit whatsoever outside of the aesthetics for ever doing any of this kind of work. And there's certainly no harm anywhere to doing this from a performance perspective. Not at all. But not everybody likes it. I'm rather certain that any machinist I ever hand this cylinder head to is probably going to roll their eyes and, it's something that makes handling that one customer just a little bit more of a pain in the ass because they have to handle the part slightly differently than they're used to doing for everyone else. But most of them understand why people do this and still respect it. So if I wasn't doing this to a car that wasn't already notorious for having it done to it, then I wouldn't be doing it at all. I'm always going to do what's right for the car and the build, though, no matter what it takes. Somehow, in just a little bit over 2 hours, I've managed to clear most all of the easy, flat, big stuff on this side, and I'm moving on to the detail work now. You saw me roll up sandpaper in the last episode real tight. It's just the easiest way to get into all the detail work. If you made enough layers to keep it rigid, then you can peel or tear some off as it wears, or cut it shorter. But I like doing this for the fine stuff because it's a lot less clumsy than the cut up pieces of Bondo spreaders. Maintaining edges here is a little bit less important because I'm not trying to reshape anything, I'm just going after that texture. It doesn't take pressure, it takes repetition. I mentioned in an earlier episode that the grain of the casting felt different here on this side of the cylinder head than it did on the others. And it still does. I swear the exhaust side is harder, and this one right here feels like it scratches deeper. It's like softer, There's a difference between the two, and I think you'll notice that with your own parts. It seems to be maintaining this characteristic even still on step 4, and this side has all the letters, the oil galley plug protrusions, the seal bosses, thermostat stuff, This is all the detail work right here. And I just blew right past the 12-hour mark. Oops. Let's take a look at what we got. Most of it cleaned up really nice. We've only been on this side for about 3 hours now, and I see there's some vertical scratches still, and it looks to me like a couple more hours might do it some good. But I've got to spend a little bit more time around the deck flange, and so far it looks like it's moving about as fast as the exhaust side, which is still doing that glowing thing there. I love it. I pretty much stuck with the sanding rolls for every single bit of the detail work on this side of the head with what's left, except for right here. Even the flat areas around the flange are a little bit complicated, but if I don't have a large flat area to have to blend, then the easiest tool for all of this is what you see right here, the rolled up piece of sandpaper. If you want those guitar calluses without all this sanding and polishing practice, well then you can just roll up a bunch of sandpaper real tight, and it does the exact same thing. You can see how whether I need to cover a large curved area like all the bolt flanges or the precision blend some other detail work into place, it pretty much does it all for the detail work. Use the spreaders for the large flat areas for making straight edges and defining your corners. Just follow the reflections of light and let it guide you into creating an even, consistent, smooth, linear texture. And then spend a little extra time at the end of your work on that side, blending in all of your edges. 14 hours and 20 minutes now, done with the thermostat side. Compared to how this has been so far, we're flying through this now. What a relief. I've got all the vertical stuff cleaned up, got my linear texture game tight, and all the details are dug out ready for the next pass. Now there's just one side left of step 4 before the whole process changes for the first real time. But just look at that exhaust side again. The reflections are showing up before the polishing stage. Isn't that cool? The thermostat side's going to do the same thing once we flip it if I did everything right. But I'm on a roll right now, so I'm just going to keep plowing rows and get through this. The intake side is the one that we got out of sync so that I could give you the power tool example. Now I'm having to do this one vertically. But check that out. See? Doing the difficult stuff first. You don't need to play tricks on yourself for motivation anymore. When you're sanding vertically on this side, you get to use the biggest spreader on all the flat stuff. And flat is flat. Just keep fresh sandpaper in your hand and keep rotating that sandpaper to a clean unused spot every few minutes for best results. And for the greatest time savings, use pressure if you want. With the big spreader and the large flat areas, there's no harm in it. Just keep that accumulated abrasive dust away from where you're working so that you don't carve deep scratches to have to clean up with your next pass. Really, I wanted to quit after I finished the second side, and I wanted to get a good night's sleep, but I figured that I'd finish these other 3 memory cards off first since I was already out here. I finished between 75 to 80% of this side in only about an hour and a half. This one is going way faster than what I expected. But here more than ever before, I've got a great example of how you keep your bearings straight once you get to that dull milky gray glow in the medium grits where everything smooth just melts together. This is the moving camera thing that I mentioned earlier. Because there's spots that are either finished or not worked at all, you can clearly see what happens in the reflections whenever I move the camera up and down. There's your guide that I've been talking about for 3 videos now. The same effect you see here happens on the horizontal stuff whenever you move it side to side. All you need is the light behind you. Let the light be your sensei. Step 0 through 2 are all about finding the right student and making him paint your house, paint your fence, sand the decks, wash your cars. Cheapest labor I've ever bought and paid him with a white cloth belt. Sucker! Anyway, when you're up close to the part, it shows its weaknesses. By then, you'll know what you need to attack. Step 3 and 4 are practice for your green belt, and by now, as I mentioned, with all this practice, you can now feel it. It's ingrained. Step 5 is where you get your new uke to have to deal with. Be the nage or the shite. Either way, your green belt is at the end if you can tsuke your way through that uke and get to step 6. None of you have any clue what I'm talking about, but I've been sitting here for so long that I've explored every single corner of my brain, and this is what happened. I've figured out everything else in the world at this point, and that's precisely why I'm only talking about and showing you this. I'm already starting to see the defects in the finish from the power tool usage, but I think I can still knock it out if I'm lucky. I even double planed this intake side once already trying to knock it out, and that's why the grain direction here is 90 degrees off from the rest of everything else. It really doesn't matter so much on the intake side because of how cramped and buried it is, remember? But if you want to put a mirror on a thing, then you want that thing planed perfectly flat if it's going to reflect distant objects. I got it flat enough that it's going to make crystal clear reflections of everything that's bolted around it, but I can tell it's not as perfect as that exhaust side where the entire job has been done 100% by hand. Let this be the series where we can compare the both, on one part. You've seen every second of what I've done here, just really, really fast. I lightly and carefully used a Dremel sanding buff to accelerate the removal of the scale layer, remember? And that was 5 passes of planing with sandpaper ago. I know it's there, but nobody else is ever going to be able to tell, and I'll laugh at you while you try to find it because you won't. Stay completely away from the injector seal bosses, by the way. I smooth all the way up around them, but maintain that sharp edge around the hole. Do not remove any of the lip around the boss. Do not sand it shorter or round it down into the hole, and especially protect these things whenever you're polishing. You do not want any material removed from this area on a turbo car at any stage, and some of these stages can be really aggressive. You'll notice that I left all the manifold and bolt flanges completely alone, too. Thicknesses mean things. They're really important. Don't ever change the way everything fits on your engine while you're doing this. Just change how those things look while they're fitting correctly. Very important. It's all for looks after all. The exhaust side's doing that thing it does again. Look at it. The clock stopped about 5 minutes before I quit working, but it's 5 minutes away from being 18 hours. So we're just going to call the Milky Smooth Cut at 18 hours. See what happens when you get the early steps right, when you have nothing to clean up with a finer grit? I owe my whole dojo to those supporting my production on Patreon because they give me all the resources necessary for me to document my own training and then give it away to all of you. There's things that YouTubers say that I won't beg for anymore. Instead, I'll keep this one focused. Stay tuned for step 5 because we're going for that green belt.